Good morning. Good morning to those of you who are in the room with us, and good morning to those who are joining us online. Good to be gathered on this Sunday morning. My name is Kathryn Bush, and I am the Associate Rector for Formation here at Calvary Church. And today we're going to be having a conversation with Calvary's senior warden, Kathryn Word. But that's not her day job. Her day job is that she's the Chief Development Officer at MIFA. And I want to set up the conversation just a little bit. This is the fifth in a series of conversations that we have hosted here in the Great Hall throughout Lent that we're calling Practice What You Preach, connecting the dots between our Lenten Preaching Series preachers and their stories and their backgrounds with the stories of Calvary folk, and the stories hopefully with all of our lives, how all of these things intersect, and that the preaching event and the pulpit is not kind of separate and siloed, but that we see the connection and the connective tissue between all of these things. And the reason that Kathryn and I are talking today is in anticipation of our Wednesday Lenten Preaching Series, which is not one but two preachers in the pulpit. We're all curious as to how that's actually going to work. But on Wednesday, Rabbi Micah Greenstein of Temple Israel and Reverend Sam Teitel from Church of the River Unitarian Church will both be here preaching. They will also both be our dialogue guests on Wednesday night at 6:15, doing something kind of like this, and but hosted by Scott Walters. And they're again, we're all very curious as to see what a shared pulpit between these two looks like just logistically. But also one of the things that they are modeling for us is this interfaith intersection, this connection. They have, as you will learn or you may already know, a genuine friendship and affection for one another, and they asked to do it this way. They were really excited about kind of partnering in this way. So what we wanted to talk about today is actually the very rich interfaith life of Memphis. That the Sam and Micah story is just one example of the ways that our lives are really connected between and amongst people of different faiths. So it would be really easy to think that Memphis is just variations on Christian churches. There's one on every corner when there's not a Walgreens. And but really, actually, there's a remarkable depth and a broad religious experience in Memphis, both the Jewish community, which we'll be modeling later this week and talking a good bit about today, but also a strong presence of the Hindu community, a growing Muslim population, and folks who bring just a richness and a diversity of religious practice to Memphis that both Kathryn and I have had the opportunity to experience in our workplaces, and it's kind of trickled into our lives in some intriguing ways. So what I wanted to do today is just to kind of, for us to have a little bit of conversation and then maybe to join with y'all who are here in the room, or if there are folks online who want to share stories about what we have learned, what's been hard, what's been lovely, what's been really good and rich about a more multifaceted life of encounter. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story in a minute, but I want to start with Kathryn's story because her background is a little different. So if you want to tell us a little bit about hi, and
hi.
Where and how you grew up and how you got to this place.
So hi, I'm glad to be with y'all today. I grew up in a small town about 50 miles north of Memphis, although my husband likes to say that it's about 50 years north of Memphis, and there is some truth in that. It was a small town. We knew everybody. It was a very evangelical town. There weren't other faiths represented at all. I grew up in the public school there. It was the only school. And it was an interesting sort of experience looking back on it. At the time, I think I was fortunate enough in my life to work for an organization called Facing History that described the air that you breathe, the things that you breathe in as smog, and the smog from the racial division in the town where I grew up was intense, although no one realized it, I don't think. So we grew up in a very segregated community, and when I say things like this, I graduated in 1996, which seems like a long time ago to me now, but it really wasn't that long ago in the grand scheme of things. And we had separate proms. We had separate cheerleading squads. See Pat's face. We had, early on, looking back, I think in the 4th grade, and we all went to school together, right? I've known these kids since kindergarten, but in the 4th or 5th grade, there was a general separation from the optional classes to the regular classes, and the optional classes were all the white kids, and the regular classes were all of my African American friends. And no one questioned it. All of our after football dances, we had a white organization that had white dances, and there was a black organization that had dances for the black kids, and it was just the way it was. And I want to be clear that my parents did not raise me this way, although we didn't talk about it either. There was pride in the Confederate flag. We were raised with the Old South and the antebellum beauty. And Daughters of the Confederacy was a very big thing, and you really wanted to be a part of it. And there was a lot of, another thing, our mayor would walk around town in a Confederate uniform.
Oh.
In the 90s.
I knew some of this. That's quite a.
So it was just the way it was, and I didn't question it. I didn't even think about questioning it long until adulthood, when I started realizing that this wasn't normal. This was not a normal way to grow up. It wasn't the way I wanted my children to grow up, and so I did not grow up with a rich interfaith background, or enter anything really, background. And so moving to Memphis and having the opportunity to work with amazing organizations like MIFA and Facing History has been a gift to me, because it's just, every day has been a growth opportunity, and I still have so much more to learn.
Is that us? You hear that whistle? Okay. Sorry. Is it that microphone on the tape? Oh, it just went away. Okay. That's we've talked some, and I've known you for a while. We're friends,
Right?
And so I've known some of these things, but there's some new details to that.
Yeah, it was, I remember the very first openly gay person that I met. And I remember being surprised because he was amazing and lovely, and I hadn't had any experience with that before. I remember having black friends in college, and it being there was a little bit of tension when I brought a couple of my friends home. Again, not with my parents. I want to be clear that my parents are wonderful people, but in the town, it was just, people were kind of aghast. And so it's just been a real learning journey for me. Mm-hmm. And being a part of Calvary, I grew up in an evangelical background, so being a part of Calvary has been a huge part of that journey for me. And God loves everyone. Right. Which is so true, but I don't think I was raised that way. To breathing in that smog, I don't think I was raised believing that necessarily.
So I grew up in Memphis, at the same time. We're roughly the same age, a little bit older, but in a different story. And I don't want to hold it up as a better story. It's just a different story. I was raised here in town. I went to St. Mary's for most of I went to Grace St. Luke's and then to St. Mary's, so that was my educational experience, which was a predominantly white institution by and large. It was even more so then, it still is to some extent now, though they're really doing extraordinary work to build a more beautiful community. But one of my early experience, or one of the things that shaped me a lot that I didn't know at the time, because we were kids, you don't realize it until you get some perspective on it, is that my dad is a lawyer, and the law firm that he was a part of was led by and was predominantly Jewish men. And so my dad was at that point, kind of rising up through the ranks. So he was the younger attorney in the community. So we were the ones being invited to these other folks' houses. And so we were guests in their homes, in Jewish families' homes, and they were that was the person who had the swimming pool, and that was so to me these people were they were friends of my family's. They were generous, they were gracious, and they were our hosts. And then at St. Mary's, while it was especially then, as I said, much less so now, predominantly white, it was religiously diverse. So it's an Episcopal school, but I would sit in chapel next to Hindu and Jewish friends, and we would all have this shared experience. And I would kneel and say the prayers. They would politely sit next to me reverently, and they got what they got from it, and I got what I got from it. But we were all in the same room, and then we would get up from that, and the same people would walk into class, and it was kind of a seamless experience for me. That church for me, because I also went to Holy Communion, so my church was also my chapel. My school was also my church home. Was very much kind of the lines were really blurry for me as a kid to remember this is Sunday version, this is Monday through Friday version. But it was a very wide open conversation and experience. I know now that my peers and friends, especially of other backgrounds, were having a different experience than I was. That was sometimes challenging, probably often challenging. But that they also knew that they were loved and welcomed and respected. It was actually I had some stories to share from college, but I was in seminary before I really realized that was not everybody's experience of the Episcopal Church. That not everybody, I knew that kind of up here, but it hadn't really sunk in. My parents as well were, my father in particular is very interested in the religious perspectives and traditions of all kinds of folks. So he would be sitting in church on Sundays, and when the sermon was not what he was interested in listening to, he would pull a book out of it. He always had a book in his pocket. And he would pull a book out and just start reading, and that book might have been a novel. It usually wasn't, but it would just as likely have been the Tao Te Ching, talking about Taoism, in church. Again, so for me, the boundaries were very blurry between these religious expressions. And I'm sitting next to him, and he's got this other book in his hand, and I'm trying to follow along in the Book of Common Prayer. It's like, okay, what is happening here? So I had that in my background, which is so different from yours, and then to think about how you came to Memphis and your arrival through these very, very intentionally religiously diverse and intersectional organizations. So I know I know you started at Catholic Charities, but
Right. I started at ALSAC years before that.
Yeah, so, yeah.
And then I worked at MIFA for several years. Loved it. I'm back there now. And MIFA was, an experience for me as well. It's one of those, I sound so naive when I say this, but you know that poverty is there. And poverty's in your face every day, but until you see it in mothers who are desperate to get help for their children, or until you deliver meals to people and you're the only person that they see that day or that week, it's a different, that was just a huge sort of eye-opening experience for me. I had not experienced poverty on a personal level like that before with others. And so what drew me to Catholic Charities was their refugee program. At the time, they had a huge refugee program. They were the primary way that refugees came into Memphis. And I got to know so many people, so many families who had come from all over, from Vietnam and from Afghanistan and from Korea. And their tradition was, you talk about bringing people into, how you were brought into to other folks' home. Their tradition was on Thanksgiving to cook a Thanksgiving meal for the staff at Catholic Charities. And it was obviously very multicultural. They would wear the dress from their countries. They would bring traditional foods. They would have us down. They would explain to us why these meals were special in the countries that they came from. And it was such a joyous experience for me to have those moments with these families and to learn their stories. At the time, Hank and I had Harry, so we were new parents, and that was, I can just remember going home and carrying the weight of those stories with me. What would I do if I had to leave my country with nothing but the clothes on my back? How would I survive? The fortitude of these amazing people was really, the resiliency was just amazing. And then I went to Facing History, which was an entirely new experience for me. So my parents were public school teachers. My father taught history for many, many years. And so I knew the basics of history, but I didn't know the important pieces of history. And my father will even say, we just gloss over the Reconstruction era because it's a hard thing to teach. And that's true, but oh my gosh, how important it is that we learn that piece of history, right? And what took us from the Reconstruction era, where there were so many good things happening, in a sense, to 100 years later, where we needed a civil rights movement. What happened in that time period? That was never explained to me. And so Facing History not only gave me that experience, but because it was founded by a Jewish woman from Memphis, I should add, Margot Sternstrom, learning so much about the Holocaust and the Jewish tradition. It was just an unbelievably rich experience for me, but I think the one story that stands out the most is, let me back up for a moment. So I lived in my small town in 2001 when 9/11 happened. And so you can imagine that in a small town with many small minds, that 9/11 took on a different sort of form. It was all about hatred of the other, and not even a willingness to understand that not everyone who was Muslim was a terrorist. It immediately became us and them. And so when I was at Facing History, I met a young woman named Amal Altareb. And Amal was born in California to Yemeni parents, and they moved back to Yemen when she was a year old. And in the 7th grade, they moved to Memphis to be with family members. So Amal came to Memphis in the 7th grade. She didn't speak any English. She didn't read English. She entered Central High School. Her father would stay up with her until 3 and 4 in the morning, translating her homework with her so that she could excel. And she ended up being valedictorian of her class at Central High School, and she's finishing her senior year at Yale. And so I really got to know Amal. I got chills just saying that. I really got to know Amal and meet her family and learn their values, but also hear their fears. And it was just one of the most rich moments of my entire life. I'm so thankful that I had that experience with Amal and others like her.
And I think, too, it's so interesting, and maybe this is an experience of folks in the room, and we'll have an opportunity for y'all to share some of this as well, that there's, I was a Facing History teacher for a few years and learned so much that I hadn't been taught, that then I was being asked to teach. and just the richness and the way that the Facing History material asks everyone in the room to tell their own story before we tell the story of the Holocaust. So there's just good process in there. But thinking through all of that, like whether it's, you know, the institution of Catholic Charities or the institution of the school or the curriculum, that what it often is, oh, it's this person. It's in a mall, or it's this friend, or this moment with, you know, it's a one-on-one human encounter when we kind of get past, I mean, I think I'm a big fan of reading and studying and learning and of institutional work and kind of, you know, official things, but it's so true that our hearts are much more often changed when we meet one person and we sit in their home and we hear their story, and that it kind of opens up in a way that you can read and read and read, or, you know, study, and so however you might, you know, get your information, but it pierces in a different way when it's a person.
That's true. I think that's so true, and you have to be willing to, you know, Amal's story is just one of many, many that I happened to encounter during my time with Facing History, but you have to be willing to have hard conversations with people too. And I think that that's one of the gifts that I got from Facing History, because as I said, growing up in this town where I had friends, quote unquote, who were black, but we had never spent any time together. We've known each other our whole lives. You know, and in many cases, my parents knew their parents and had known them their whole lives, but we didn't have meaningful conversations growing up. And so I think the gift that I've gotten over the last few years is the ability to not be afraid to enter into difficult conversations. And I'm really happy to say that some of the kids that I sat at the table with in kindergarten now, who were separated from me in high school for various reasons, are now good friends of mine, and we have difficult conversations about religion and politics and things that are going on in the world that we wouldn't have otherwise, and that they're not having there. It's
well, and to have the curiosity to inquire, to sit and listen, and to be willing to say, let me tell you a little bit of my story, and then let me stop talking and listen for a minute and not assume that I know what you're going to, you know. So all of that give and take and willingness to be vulnerable and to be wrong, or to ask a question.
And to say, I was wrong. I'm so sorry, I was wrong.
I was wrong. Or I don't know what that is. I don't know what you're doing. I don't know what this food is. I don't know why why were you not at school yesterday? Tell me about the holiday that your family was celebrating. We missed you. You know, like, where were you? And to be curious instead of assuming and writing our own stories for people.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah. So it's particularly poignant, I think, that we're having this conversation, although it is just kind of luck of the schedule, but that we are having this conversation this weekend, and to tell the MIFA story a little bit. And now you're back at MIFA, and I think most of us are probably familiar with the kind of founding story, the founding crucible moments of MIFA. In the days following the assassination of Dr. King, there were groups of clergy from different traditions, although at that point that was pretty much Christian and Jewish folks, who met together in the basement of St. Mary's Cathedral. And so the story goes that was kind of like a safe refuge place. And if you're interested in knowing more about this story, there's a documentary being shown this afternoon at 3 o'clock at the cathedral that tells the whole story of the walk from the cathedral to City Hall and their advocacy and all of that. But MIFA is born from that kind of crucible moment of fear, when people could have turned away from each other, could have been, I mean, very easy. And a number of people did. There was more us and them, like the language that you're saying of post 9/11 could bring people together, could push people apart. And both of those things definitely happened in Memphis and everywhere in America after Dr. King's assassination. But MIFA is a coming together story, which leads to now be an interfaith, ecumenical, I mean, like a really rich gathering. I just saw the picture the other day and I'm not going to remember everybody's names, but who all was the
It was
religious representatives?
Right, it was Reverend Byron Moore and Rabbi Micah Greenstein, Bishop Phoebe, and
The imam.
yes, the
Yes.
imam.
I can't remember his last
but
name.
they delivered
Yeah.
meals together as a part of our March for Meals campaign, which was really cool. I was out of town and I missed it. It was really cool, I heard.
Yeah. They're great pictures online.
Yeah.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about it looks good when here's 4, leaders of our religious traditions, but it's also hard to get it right. And I know sometimes there are rough edges, what that's been like.
Yeah, so, MIFA still definitely, and I see Margaret over there, so Margaret, speak up if I'm not, if I say anything that's not correct. MIFA still strives very much to be an interfaith organization. We try to maintain the values that our founders had initially of uniting the community through service, which is what we do every day. I think the thing that MIFA does well and that goes across faith traditions is treat everyone with dignity and respect and an element of love. And I think that's one thing that maybe we've gotten better at with the pandemic. MIFA had operated a certain way for many, many years. I mean, you could come into MIFA at all times and see mothers and children in the lobby looking for assistance for various things, or you could see people in the thrift shop shopping, or you always see 100 meals volunteers every day. But I think one of the things that the pandemic has taught us, especially maybe with the family program side, and Margaret, Pat, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is that we've enabled people to maybe feel a little bit more human when they have to ask for assistance. Like every other place, MIFA had to close its doors and figure out new ways to serve people in March of 2020. So our family programs particularly went online and by phone. And what we found is that it allows people a degree of anonymity, so they don't have to come face to face and kind of go through the sometimes humiliating process of asking for assistance. So it allows them that. But then also what we've been reading and learning is that poverty is a burden. It's hard to be poor, and the government makes it difficult to be poor. You have to keep up with all kinds of documents, and you have to go and you have to show these documents at all these different times, most of which are during work hours from 8 to 5. So you're either trying to hold down a job so that you won't be poor anymore, or you don't have childcare for your children. So in a way, we're hoping we eliminate some of that burden by allowing people the opportunity to access an online application or access an application via phone. We are opening back up and seeing people in the lobby as well. But it's treating people of all walks of life with dignity and respect and love, I think. And I think that's what MIFA does well, and I think that's what they've done well for the 40, 50 plus years that they've been in operation.
Right, yeah. It's really, one of the things that I think is really striking to me about MIFA, and really about some of the other places that we've talked about, is that it is often, it can be intimidating as somebody who, is being asked to, if I'm going to learn something about someone else, someone who practices a different faith, somebody who grew up differently than me, someone from a different worldview or whatever that might be, to just like plop down and sit next to each other or sit face to face and look at each other and have a hard conversation, which is, as we're saying, is needed. But often the entry point for that is, before we turn and like look each other in the eye, is to actually work like the way they used to talk about children doing parallel play. So like we can serve together, right? Like I can deliver meals and you can deliver meals, and we're looking at this shared value of service, or we're looking at this shared experience in a classroom of, we all read this story, so now we're going to talk about it. And sometimes that's a really good first step to build enough rapport and connection to then be able to turn and say, well, gosh, you know, you don't go to church on Sunday, you go to synagogue on Friday evening, or you go to the mosque at Friday at noon, or you do that, but look, we just did this thing together when we were kind of parallel, and then, but it gives us then a common ground to be able to turn, because we had that shared experience, to then be able to turn and kind of come at the encounters with folks in that kind of sideways way.
Yes. Yes to all of that. I think that's right. I want to tell a story. I don't think it's a secret, and you might not even know about this, but St. Mary's in the 7th grade has started a class on philanthropy. And so they're studying the origins of philanthropy, why it's important, but then as a part of this class, they're doing a deep dive into an organization, and they've chosen MIFA as their organization. So for since the beginning of the school year, I've talked to them. Sally Hunt, who's our CEO, has spoken with them. Our senior vice presidents of family programs and meals has had many conversations with the girls, and they're learning about MIFA, and they're learning about what it means to serve people, and they're learning about volunteering. They've come to MIFA and delivered meals more than once, a huge route, which is, just as an aside, very fun for our senior meals clients. They love to see young people. But as Kathryn said, these are girls of different faiths, and we've learned that in our conversations with them. And so they are serving together and kind of having that shared experience, which we hope that they then remember and take with them as they grow up. And it's a way to kind of break down barriers to serve others. Yeah. So it's been an amazing experience for MIFA, and I think for the girls as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So so when you think back, and you started off by reflecting a little bit on your childhood, which was this one kind of environment and world, and where you are now, and obviously we're not finished stories. We've got more to learn and more experiences. But are there moments or for you where you're like, you know, like kind of like the Thanksgiving, or another example of a time when you were like, oh, this is opening something new in me, or I've learned something from this encounter, a moment like that you might
You know, share? I think it comes most often with my children these days, which is, you know, an interesting observation. But my kids, Hank and I have tried to be very intentional. He grew up in a, you know, privileged household, private school. We grew up very different ways, is what I'm trying to say, in very different communities of people. And so our perspectives coming together has been interesting when it comes to raising our kids. And one thing that we have talked a lot about is exposing them to other people, other religions, other socioeconomic groups, others that aren't like them, and being very intentional about that, but also encouraging them to learn, encouraging them to know that just because we do something a certain way doesn't mean necessarily that it's the way that they want to do it, or that it's the right way to do things. And it's been really interesting, just, you know, their conversations. Evie, for example, last night, her birthday is this week, and she's very excited about it. And I'm sure you'll all hear about it today. And Hank, what was it? She asked if she could have a mitzvah. And yeah. And I, you know, I had to pause for a second. But the fact that a 5-year-old asked me that, which is something that I would have never even known about when I was 5 years old, tells me that maybe we're on the right track, that maybe we're doing some things okay. You know, we read to them about different faith holidays. A friend of mine, Ashley Tobias, gave me a book when Evie was born called The Latkes That Won't Stop Screaming. And so we read that. So we read that. You know, it's, I think I'm learning so much from them. Yeah,
and the questions that they ask.
And the questions that they ask, and the experience that they have, which is so different than the ones I had. Right. Yeah. So it's it's a learning experience with them every day in a whole lot of ways.
Right.
But especially in those
Yay,
really
parenting.
good, rich ways.
Yeah, right.
Where they ask the good questions.
Right, exactly. So there are we've touched on a couple of organizations and experiences that we've had. Anna Kathryn, as I said, it not only happens to be your senior warden, but also has worked with these different places, which are just kind of a small glimpse and window into the larger life of Memphis. Which, again, to say, it would be very easy to paint with a broad brush and say, oh, this is a dominant Christian community. That's the story, But to really remember that there are these key, that Facing History and Ourselves, which is a national and international program, started in Memphis, and that MIFA was forged in this moment of crisis in Memphis, and now is this kind of model for service and for bringing people together for the purpose of service. And I know that there are others. I'm thinking about Micah, not Micah Greenstein, but Micah the organization, Memphis Interfaith Coalition for Action and Hope. Yes, thank you. Which again is another bringing together folks to advocate and to be engaged and purposefully to kind of knit together for greater power all of these different communities. And a lot of religious organizations, but also different secular organizations as well that are partnering with them. Calvary is a part of the Micah network. And no doubt you have others. And I'd love to hear too if there are, because it may be something that's kind of institutional, like I love this organization and what they stand for, but it may also be, I have this friend, or my next door neighbor, or the kind of one-on-one moments where perhaps some of you in the room were willing to share a moment where a friendship and an understanding and some learning happened for you in a way that was heart-opening, perhaps. And I can jump up and take the microphone around, or Robin, thanks. Robin's going to come around with a microphone if somebody, yes, Margaret Craddock. And correct all of our MIFA stories.
Please.
So I'll just kind of go back to something you mentioned, Kate, that often it's a one-on-one encounter that can open a door, open your eyes. Well, I was at MIFA when 9/11 happened, and I realized quickly MIFA is the interfaith organization. We cannot just sit still here.
Right.
I was totally unwoke about the Muslim community, the Muslim world, but I knew there was a lot of fear. I had to call David Waters to educate me on the Muslim community in Memphis.
Right.
And he said, well, there's the Muslim Society. You need to get in touch with them. So I found out that the president was a man named Dr. Kandekar. And Kate, you may remember the Kandekar girls.
I knew all the Kandekar girls. Yeah, they were all at St. Mary's.
There were 3 Kandekar girls at St. Mary's. And so I knew that they were there. And I knew that Dr. Kandekar probably was kind of suspicious of why is this woman calling me. And I was able to say, I think you're Ozma's father. That opened the door.
Right.
And from that point on, we did have dialogue, and we were able to do some things together. But, you know, he probably would have talked eventually, but that just helped it.
It built that bridge a lot
Yes.
faster. Right. To know somebody, to have
To
that
know
kind
somebody.
of connective. Yeah, absolutely. No, it's lovely.
So that was eye-opening for me, and I was able to get to know that faith community in a whole different way.
Right. Absolutely. And I think David Waters was here a few weeks ago talking about the news and journalism and politics and all of that, but his work has been really eye-opening and heart-opening, I think, for a lot of Memphians, and his storytelling about a broader faith community, originally in the Commercial Appeal and then through the various institutions and organizations and outlets that he's been a part of. But he's a great example of somebody who's shown the rest of us more to Memphis and more to the community than we might have suspected.
Margaret, I also think it's so important what you said about you realized that you didn't know.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to think, oh, well,
Yeah.
I I mean, I'm very smart. I know a lot of
Right.
things.
I'm in charge of MIFA.
I know a lot of things, but you knew that you didn't. And so you reached out and started trying to make connections to find people who could educate you and help you and connect you and teach you. And I think that's so important, and that's what everyone needs to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Others? Other examples or stories of encounter? Yeah, Mitch.
Thanks. As we've talked about how history is taught or not taught, and the various points of view, I'm reminded of a personal story. When I was at St. Mary's, in the 10th grade American history class, I thought, oh gee, here we go again. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, and it was going to be the same thing over and over, and that we'd heard in various ways. And I had a remarkable teacher who said, we're not going to do it that way. And she took each century and told us stories of things that were happening around the world, and then said, and oh, by the way, this is what was going on in the United States.
Wow.
And when we got to World War II, it was like nothing I had ever heard before. And it was an amazing focus on the Jewish faith and I can't do this without getting choked up, on the Holocaust. And we studied that and we studied that, and a year later, it was 1968. And a year later, Dr. King was killed. That year, my Girl Scout troop was going to Europe, and it was my first trip to Europe, and we had been working on this trip for 5 years. Our first stop was London. We landed at Heathrow the day that James Earl Ray had been caught at Heathrow.
Wow.
We landed and immediately went to the Trooping of the Colors. We're still in all of our Girl Scout uniforms, and people hear our accents, and they're yelling at us as the ugly Americans. And the next stop was Amsterdam, and we went to the Anne Frank house. And we got to the Anne Frank house, and we were all so close to her age, and many of us had been through this history class. And when they pulled the bookshelf back, the bookcase back, and we started to walk up the stairs where Anne and her family were hidden, just as we started up the stairs, a police car went by outside, and it still had that Gestapo siren. And we stopped in our tracks and couldn't move, because it was if we were part of all of that. And as we continued on this tour, 1968 was just such a season of hate all around the world. And as a 16 or 17-year-old, whatever I was, it was such a disappointment, because we were all so excited about this trip that we had worked so hard for all of these years. And every place that we went, our trip was changed because of things that were going on in the world. There were riots at the Sorbonne, and so we couldn't go to Paris. That had to be taken off of our trip. I mean, it was just one thing after the other. And coming from the South, there were all sorts of things that were part of our experience as well. And so listening to your stories and thinking about how we've all been brought up, and things that we know are different today, and that we continue to try to make different today, and that on a daily basis, those of us in this room are so focused on God loves you, no exceptions. I'm so grateful for all of it. A lot of it painful, and it helps us move forward as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Madge. I think it's such a testament to the power, and we've been talking about one-on-one encounters and study and all of that, and travel is part of that, and obviously travel is a great privilege, but even just thinking about, like, one of the things that my husband is better at than I am is, like, let's go to this restaurant. with that has Middle Eastern food, that is, a family-owned business or something like that. And even to you can live in Memphis and essentially travel, and to go and to not only to experience the food and the culture that comes with that, but again, if you're walking through the world with Stephen Bush, you're much more likely to stop and have a conversation with 3 people on the way in and out and really get to know the waiter and the servers than his introverted wife is. And so, but again, travel is obviously an extraordinary heart-opening experience, and we don't have to wait necessarily to travel, drive down Summer Avenue and experience just about every international cuisine, so just to think about those moments as well. Thanks for sharing your story. Others?
This is great, y'all. I grew up similar to Anna Kathryn in a context, but not. Rural town of about 8,000 northwest Arkansas. The difference would have been that Corey Cottle was the only black kid in the whole school system. So I didn't have racial diversity. We have Native American. But one of the things that was interesting, and I'm wondering about, and how this cycle of how do we reach across the divides that are actually in our life is reaching back toward rural America. And I remember a moment after I'd gotten out of college, so I had my certification that I'm middle class, and went back and became a carpenter, and started working with someone I'd gone to high school with who'd never thought about going to high school. And we're out working one day, and we were cutting some angles, and he's like, parallelogram or trapezoid? Talking about which way the angles went. And he actually had a working knowledge of geometry, probably got a D in the class, and it kind of bridged back over into a kind of intelligence that's not actually honored in the culture. Once we have divides that are educational and social strata.
Absolutely.
So that's a question in here. By the way, the last 17 years, somehow I've been in urban churches because I love being in diverse downtown urban churches, so I don't know how I got here. That's where I feel called. But I also have this part of myself that wonders, I wonder how we have those conversations back across that divide that's become so intense in our country and so destructive and such a hard one. You have thoughts on that? Can you fix it?
I cannot fix it. I wish I could. In 2015, I had the privilege and the pleasure of meeting Brian Stevenson, who at the time was working on fundraising and construction of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. And I'm sure many of you know this, but one of the takeaways, I guess would be the word, from the National Memorial for Peace and Justice is that they have memorials for every county where there was a lynching victim. But then they also have a separate memorial that communities can accept and display in their community. So it's a sort of a shared remembrance, both at the national level and then in your own community. And one of the things that, to Kathryn's point, I've been able to have really great one-on-one conversations with my parents and former educators who are friends with my parents, and classmates that I went to school with but never really knew. But in 2016, I started trying and failing to get our community interested in accepting the monument for Tipton County, where we had three recorded lynching victims. And when you read the record of the lynchings that's available through the Equal Justice Initiative, when you read about those in Tipton County, they happened in places that I know. They happened around landmarks that I know. They happened, there were people whose last names I recognized on both sides. And so it became a really personal sort of passion project for me. And I reached out to a lot of people and got nowhere. They're just not interested, or maybe they're not ready to sort of accept that burden Or I think it's even harder to accept the fact that they're wrong, and they have been wrong for so many years. The way that we were separated and segregated, and the way that we were educated was wrong. I mean, the white kids had newer textbooks, for example, in the optional classes. I mean, they're just little things like that when I think back, it was just wrong. And I just don't think that in this particular case with my particular town, they're not ready. Or they're very unwilling.
Yeah. It's really, I think, I mean, Scott, to your question, I mean, and there are pockets, I know, there's definitely resistance, and we're talking about all the beautiful examples in Memphis, but there's definitely resistance in Memphis to these stories, and there's also, heartening stories about small towns where, an immigrant family came in and they were not driven away, they were welcomed, and so they're. I mean, it's a mixed bag. Right. That's the end of the story. Is right.
I would encourage y'all all to look up "Not in Our Town," which is it's something I learned about through Facing History. But write it down and look it up and see what one town did to support some residents. It's a really interesting story that I don't have time to tell you right now. But look it up. It's called "Not in Our Town."
And because we are indeed out of time. I'm really grateful for this conversation with Anna Kathryn, and for your sharing too. And I know there's more stories. Everybody's got a story that we didn't get to hear. But I also want to say, because it is hard, and it can be discouraging and dispiriting. But there are so many ways to move forward together. And I mean, the obvious plug is to say, come on Wednesday and hear Micah and Sam, and we hope you will, or listen online, or come Wednesday night. Because I think it is a reminder of the bridges that are possible, and the connective tissue that does, and what does bind us, and what we do, the values we do share, the things that are universal, which is kind of nice to have that to hang your hat on some days. It's good to remember those are true stories too. And I'm appreciative of our conversation and of Calvary's welcoming, and throughout the Lenten Preaching Series, the intentionality and the move over the years to welcome clergy and folk from different backgrounds into our pulpit, into this place, and to struggle with that, and then to figure out a way to do it with genuine hospitality it's just another good story. So end of mini sermon. But thank you all. It's good to be with you. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.